What if the story of a world-ending flood wasn't first written in Hebrew, but pressed into clay tablets 1,000 years earlier by hands that claimed to remember what came before? What if the oldest libraries on earth weren't filled with mythology, but with testimony, preserved by scribes who believed they were recording not legend, but survival? Beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, in fragments scattered across museum vaults and forgotten excavation sites, lies a collection of clay tablets that predate the Bible, predate the Greeks, predate nearly every civilization we think we know. And carved into those tablets, in wedge-shaped script older than the pyramids, is an account of a catastrophic flood so detailed, so specific, that when archaeologists first translated them in the 19th century, they stopped and stared in silence. Because the Sumerians had written it all down first. The Ark, the divine warning, the animals saved in pairs, the sole family chosen to survive, the waters that drowned the world. Every element we associate with Noah's flood appears in Sumerian records, but earlier, stranger, and filled with details that feel less like myth and more like documentation. Before we descend too deeply into these ancient mysteries, take just a moment to subscribe if you're drawn to the kind of history that lives in the spaces between sleep and wonder. And if you're still here, drifting with me through this story, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what hour of the night or day has brought you here. I like to imagine this narrative unfolding across continents and time zones, a whispered conversation carried into rest. The story waiting in these tablets doesn't just parallel what we know. It predates it, complicates it, and suggests something far more unsettling. That the flood narratives weren't invented by different cultures independently, but remembered by them. Remembered from something real, something that actually happened. And the Sumerians, humanity's first literate civilization, obsessively wrote it all down as though they understood that memory itself could drown if not pressed into clay and baked into permanence. Tonight we're going to follow the trail of those tablets. We'll walk through the ruins of Uruk and Eridu, cities that shouldn't exist yet with the sophistication they display. We'll meet the scribes who recorded star charts that match modern telescopes, mathematical systems that still govern our clocks, and flood accounts that name the survivors, describe the dimensions of the vessel, and chronicle the waters rising over mountains. We'll read what they wrote about the world before the deluge, a civilization they describe not as primitive, but as advanced, ruled by kings whose reigns stretched for thousands of years. And we'll ask the question that archaeologists have whispered in excavation tents for over a century. If the Sumerians were merely inventing stories, why did they write them with the precision of eyewitnesses? This isn't a journey that offers easy answers. The deeper we go into Sumerian records, the more the boundaries blur between history and myth, between documentation and memory, between what we think we know and what the clay insists we've forgotten. These tablets were written to last, fired in kilns, buried in libraries, sealed in jars, as though the scribes understood they were preserving something the world would try to erase. And now, thousands of years later, we hold those fragments in our hands and feel the faint pulse of a question pressed into every wedge-shaped mark. What if everything we call the beginning was actually the rebuilding? What if the flood wasn't legend, but the event that separated us from a world we can no longer remember? The clay still whispers, and if we listen closely enough, between the syntax and the star charts, we might finally hear what it's been trying to tell us all along. They appeared suddenly, impossibly, in the flatlands between two rivers. No gradual emergence from primitive camps, no slow evolution from hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. The Sumerians arrived in what is now southern Iraq around 4000 BCE, already equipped with something no other human culture possessed. Cities. Not villages that grew into towns over centuries. Cities. Planned, organized, sophisticated urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, surrounded by irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland, governed by laws written in a script that appeared fully formed, as though copied from an earlier template that no longer exists. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash. These names echo across 6,000 years, the first city-states humanity ever knew, and they did not fumble their way into existence. They rose complete with monumental architecture, complex social hierarchies, specialized professions, long-distance trade networks, and administrative systems that required literacy, mathematics, and record-keeping on a scale that suggests not innovation, but inheritance. Mainstream archaeology tells us that civilization is a slow process, a pyramid of gradual development. Nomadic bands become agricultural villages, villages become towns, towns become cities, and somewhere along that patient timeline, writing emerges as a necessity of commerce and administration. Except the Sumerians did not follow this pattern. They bypassed it entirely. When they appear in the archaeological record, they already have all of it. The cities, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, the legal codes, the religious institutions. Everything arrives together, packaged, as though civilization itself were not invented by the Sumerians, but imported. Where did they come from? The Sumerians themselves offered no origin story. They did not claim to have migrated from distant lands or descended from earlier peoples. Their own records simply begin with the statement that civilization was lowered from heaven. Not built, not discovered, lowered. As though it had existed somewhere else first and been transferred, complete and operational, to the land between the rivers. And if there is one thing that defines Sumerian civilization above all else, one obsession that consumed them more than conquest, more than wealth, more than even the worship of their gods, it was this: the need to write everything down, to record, to preserve, to ensure that knowledge once given would never be lost again. The Sumerians were not just the first civilization, they were the first archivists, the first people to understand that memory is fragile, that oral tradition can be corrupted, that without physical records the past dissolves into myth and then into nothing. And so they wrote, obsessively, relentlessly, on every surface they could press a stylus into. Clay tablets by the hundreds of thousands, recording not just the grand narratives of kings and gods, but the mundane texture of daily life, tax receipts, grain distributions, marriage contracts, property disputes, medical prescriptions, school exercises, personal letters, shopping lists. Nothing was too small to document. Nothing was too trivial to preserve. It was as though the Sumerians understood at some fundamental level that their world was impermanent, that catastrophe was always near, and that the only defense against oblivion was repetition, redundancy, endless duplication of knowledge across clay and time. This compulsion gave birth to cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script that would dominate the ancient Near East for 3 millennia. The word comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, describing the triangular impressions made by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay at an angle. The tablets were then baked or left to dry in the sun, transforming wet clay into a permanent archive, harder than papyrus, more durable than parchment, immune to fire if already baked, and capable of surviving burial for thousands of years without decay. Cuneiform was not the world's first writing system. That distinction may belong to proto-writing symbols found in earlier cultures, but it was the first true script capable of recording the full complexity of human thought. Not just pictograms representing objects, but phonetic signs that could capture sound, grammar, abstraction, poetry. A single cuneiform sign could function as a logogram representing an entire word, a syllable in a spoken phrase, or a determinative symbol clarifying meaning. It was layered, flexible, infinitely adaptable, and capable of recording everything from epic poetry to chemical formulas with equal precision. Within a few centuries of its development, cuneiform had spread beyond Sumer. The Akkadians adopted it for their Semitic language. The Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, and Elamites all used it. It became the diplomatic script of the ancient world, the language of trade and treaty, preserved in royal archives from Anatolia to Egypt. And yet it began with the Sumerians, with their strange, isolated, linguistically orphaned tongue, pressed into clay as though language itself was something too precious to trust to air and memory alone. The libraries they built were not repositories of literature in the modern sense. They were fortresses of knowledge. The Great Library at Nippur contained over 60,000 tablets, organized by subject, catalogued, cross-referenced. Scribes maintained indexes, copied deteriorating text onto fresh clay, and trained new generations in the sacred art of writing. To be a scribe in Sumer was to belong to an elite class, second only to priests and kings. Literacy was power. It was access to the divine codes, the miyamd, the formulas that governed reality itself. And the scribes understood their role not as creators, but as custodians. They were preserving something older than themselves, something that had been entrusted to humanity and which could not be allowed to fade. And what they preserved, above all, were lists. The Sumerians loved lists. They made lists of everything: gods, cities, professions, plants, animals, stones, stars. But the most important list, the one that haunts historians and archaeologists to this day, is the Sumerian king list. The king list is a document like no other in ancient history. It claims to record every ruler who ever governed Mesopotamia, from the moment kingship was lowered from heaven down to historical kings whose reigns we can verify through independent evidence. The problem is that the list does not begin with history. It begins with something else, something impossible. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. 28,800 years. The next king, Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third, Enmenluana, reigned for 43,200 years. On and on, the list continues, documenting 8 kings who ruled before the flood, each one reigning for tens of thousands of years. The combined length of their reigns totals 241,200 years. Then the flood comes. The text states plainly, the flood swept over, and after the flood, kingship descends from heaven once more. But the kings who follow have shorter reigns, still impossibly long, 1,200 years, 900 years, 600 years, but gradually decreasing until, by the time we reach historical kings like Gilgamesh, the reigns drop to plausible human lifespans, as though something changed, as though the conditions that allowed those ancient rulers to live for millennia had ended abruptly with the flood. Mainstream scholars dismiss the early portion of the king list as mythology, symbolic numbers, inflated propaganda designed to give divine legitimacy to later rulers. And yet, the Sumerians did not treat it as mythology. They treated it as history. The king list was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, preserved in multiple versions across different cities, integrated into chronicles and administrative documents. To the Sumerians, these were not legends, they were records, and they were not alone. Other cultures preserved similar traditions. The Egyptian historian Manetho recorded dynasties of gods and demigods, who ruled Egypt for thousands of years before mortal kings took the throne. Hindu texts describe cycles of time called yugas, ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years when humans lived far longer than they do now. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, documented 10 antediluvian kings who ruled for a combined total of 432,000 years. The numbers differ, but the structure is identical. A pre-flood world populated by rulers who lived impossibly long, a catastrophic deluge, and a post-flood world where human lifespans shortened dramatically. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps these lists are all fragments of the same memory, echoes of a world that existed before the flood, where something about human life was fundamentally different. Whether those numbers represent actual years or some other unit of time, whether they describe individuals or dynasties, we may never know, but the Sumerians recorded them, carefully, repeatedly, as though the information mattered, as though forgetting would be worse than being disbelieved, and the clay on which they wrote ensured they would not be forgotten. While papyrus scrolls crumbled, while parchment rotted, while wooden tablets burned, the clay endured. Buried beneath sand and silt for millennia, the tablets waited. Cities rose and fell above them. Empires conquered and collapsed. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs all ruled the land where Sumer once thrived. And through it all, beneath layers of earth and time, the tablets slept, indestructible, patient, waiting for someone to remember how to read. That moment came in the 19th century when European archaeologists began excavating the mounds of Mesopotamia. What they found astonished them. Not scattered relics, but entire libraries, rooms filled with tablets stacked like books, organized, catalogued, preserved. In 1849, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, a collection of over 30,000 tablets dating to the 7th century BCE. But many of those tablets were copies of far older Sumerian texts, preserved by Assyrian scribes who understood even then that they were custodians of ancient knowledge. Then, in 1853, a young assistant named Hormuzd Rassam, working at Nineveh, discovered a series of tablets that would change everything. Among them was a text that described a great flood, a man who built a boat, animals saved in pairs, and the waters that destroyed the world. It was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it predated the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years. The discovery sent shockwaves through European academia and religious institutions. For centuries, the biblical flood had been considered a unique revelation, a story given by God to the Hebrew people. But here it was, carved in clay, written by pagans millennia older and far more detailed. The Sumerian flood was not a parable. It was a Gilu, Agi-Shur, an event documented with names, locations, dimensions, and durations. The Sumerians wrote as though they were filing a report, not composing a myth. Scholars scrambled to translate the tablets. George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist, worked obsessively to piece together the broken fragments. When he finally read the flood passage aloud to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in 1872, the room fell silent. Prime Minister Gladstone attended the lecture. The press covered it like a scandal. The Daily Telegraph funded an expedition to find the missing pieces. The ancient world had spoken, and it was saying something different than anyone expected. More excavations followed. The cities of Ur, Uruk, Lagash and Nippur were unearthed. Tens of thousands more tablets were recovered, and with them came the realization that Sumerian accounts were not derivative. They were the originals. Every flood story that came after, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew, borrowed from Sumer. Every creation myth, every king list, every legal code, every hymn to the gods, all of it traced back to those first cities between the rivers where writing began, and memory was made permanent. And the Sumerian versions were different, more complete, less edited by theology and politics. They contained details that later cultures omitted or sanitized. They named the gods who caused the flood, and the god who defied the decree to save humanity. They described the construction of the ark with engineering precision. They recorded what the world was like before the waters came, and what the survivors found when the waters receded. The Sumerians wrote as though they had access to eyewitness accounts, as though the flood was not ancient history to them, but recent memory, something their ancestors had survived and sworn never to forget. Which brings us to the question that haunts every scholar who studies these texts. Why were the Sumerians so obsessed with recording everything? Why this compulsion to document, preserve, and duplicate knowledge across thousands of tablets? It was not practical necessity alone. Other civilizations managed trade and administration without such extensive archives. It was something deeper, an anxiety, a fear of forgetting, as though the Sumerians knew, at some collective, cultural level, that the world had ended before, that knowledge had been lost, that civilization had nearly vanished, and that clay, patient and indestructible, was the only way to ensure it would not happen again. They were not writing for themselves. They were writing for us. Across 6 millennia, through the silence of buried cities and forgotten languages, they left their testimony pressed into clay, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to read it again. And what they preserved, what they recorded with such obsessive care, was not just the story of their own rise. It was the memory of what came before, the world that drowned, the knowledge that survived, and the gods, or beings, or ancestors who taught them how to begin again. November 1872, the British Museum. A young assistant curator named George Smith sat hunched over a fragment of clay covered in wedge-shaped marks. He had been translating tablets recovered from the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, part of a massive library that once belonged to King Ashurbanipal. The work was painstaking, technical, academic, until he reached line 145 of the tablet labelled K, 3375. His hands began to shake. The text described a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A righteous man warned in advance. Instructions to build a vessel. Animals brought aboard in pairs. Waters covering the earth. A bird sent out to search for dry land. The survival of a single family from which all future generations would descend. George Smith stood up from his desk and, according to witnesses, began to pace the room in a state of visible agitation. Then, overcome with excitement, he started removing his clothing, an act so unusual for a Victorian scholar that his colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. But Smith hadn't lost anything. He had found something. Something that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship forever. He had discovered that the story of Noah's flood, the centerpiece of Genesis, the divine narrative that millions believed was revealed directly to Moses by God, was not original. It was a copy. A Hebrew adaptation of a story that had been circulating in Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years before the Bible was written. The flood narrative wasn't divinely inspired. It was inherited, borrowed, translated from an older source, and that source was Sumerian. The tablet Smith translated was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the 11th tablet, where the hero Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the sole human survivor of the Great Deluge. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh's story, how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how he was secretly warned, how he built a vessel, survived the flood, and was granted immortality as a reward. Every major element of the Noah story was there, not similar, not parallel, identical in structure, sequence, and detail. The implications were immediate and devastating to traditional biblical interpretation. If the flood story predated Genesis by more than a millennium, recorded by a polytheistic civilization that worshipped gods the Bible explicitly condemned, then what did that mean for the nature of divine revelation? Had the Hebrew scribes unknowingly copied from pagan sources, or had both cultures preserved fragments of an even older story, a memory so ancient and so catastrophic that it echoed across every civilization that came after? The debate exploded across Europe. Theologians scrambled to defend the originality of Scripture. Archaeologists dug deeper into Mesopotamian ruins searching for more tablets, and they found them. Dozens of them, hundreds, all telling versions of the same story. The flood was not a Hebrew memory, it was a human memory, and the oldest, most complete versions came from the people who claimed to have survived it, the Sumerians, The Epic of Gilgamesh is the version most people know, but it is not the oldest. Gilgamesh himself was a Sumerian king of Uruk who ruled around 2700 BCE, and his story was composed centuries after his death. The flood narrative within it is borrowed from an earlier text, one that archaeologists would not fully recover until the early 20th century, a text called Atrahasis. The Atrahasis epic is older, rawer, more disturbing. It was composed around 1800 BCE in Old Babylonian, but it draws directly from Sumerian sources that date back at least another 1,000 years. Unlike Gilgamesh, which is an adventure story with the flood as a single episode, Atrahasis is entirely focused on the relationship between gods and humanity, and why that relationship went so catastrophically wrong. The story begins not with humanity, but with divine labour. The Anunnaki, the great gods, ruled the cosmos, but the actual work of maintaining the world, digging rivers, building mountains, dredging canals, fell to a lower class of gods called the Igigi. For 40 years the Igigi laboured, and then they revolted. They burned their tools, they marched to the house of Enlil, the chief god, and surrounded it at night. The divine order was collapsing. Enlil, furious and frightened, called an emergency council of the gods. The solution came from Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. He proposed creating a new species, a worker race that could take over the labour, humanity. But not from clay alone. The tablets are explicit about this. A god was slaughtered, one of the rebels, and his blood, his essence, was mixed with clay. From this combination, humans were formed. We were made from divine material, but for a servile purpose. We were, according to Atrahasis, designed to work, and for a time it functioned. Humanity multiplied, cities rose, fields were ploughed, temples were maintained, the gods rested. But then something unexpected happened. Humans became too successful. They multiplied too quickly. Their noise, their activity, their sheer population became unbearable to the gods. The tablets say that Enlil could not sleep. The uproar of mankind disturbed him. Humanity had become a plague. So Enlil decided to reduce the population. First he sent disease, then drought, then famine. Each time the human population was cut down, and each time Enki secretly intervened. He warned his favourite human, a man named Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise. Enki taught Atrahasis how to survive each plague, how to appease the gods, how to organise humanity's response, and each time the population recovered. Enlil grew furious. His solutions were being undone, and so he proposed a final, irreversible measure. A flood. Not a local flood. Not a seasonal overflow. A deluge that would erase humanity entirely, wipe the earth clean, and restore silence to the world. The Council of the Gods agreed, and they swore an oath of secrecy. No god would warn humanity. The extinction would be total, but Enki could not allow it. He was bound by the oath, forbidden from speaking directly to Atrahasis. So he found a loophole. He went to the wall of Atrahasis's reed house and spoke to the wall itself, knowing Atrahasis was on the other side. "Wall, listen to me," he whispered. "Reed house, pay attention. Tear down your house, build a boat. Abandon possessions, save life. Bring aboard the seed of all living things." Atrahasis heard, and he obeyed. The description of the boat is detailed, technical, almost like a blueprint. It was to be a cube, equal in length, width, and height, coated with bitumen inside and out, divided into compartments, sealed with pitch. The dimensions varied slightly across versions, but the structure was consistent. This was not a symbolic vessel. It was engineered, designed to survive something catastrophic. Atrahasis built the ark. He loaded it with his family, animals of every kind and something else. Craftsmen, skilled workers, people who knew metallurgy, weaving, carpentry. The text specifies this. The survivors were not random. They were selected for their knowledge, their ability to preserve and transmit the skills of civilization. This was not just a rescue. It was a preservation protocol. And then the flood came. The descriptions are apocalyptic. The heavens roared, the earth shook, the storm god Adad unleashed thunder. The Anunnaki lifted their torches, setting the land ablaze with lightning. Then the dams of heaven broke. The fountains of the deep erupted. Water came from above and below simultaneously. For 6 days and 6 nights the deluge raged. The gods themselves, the ones who had sent the flood, fled in terror to the highest heavens, cowering like dogs. Even they had not anticipated the scale of destruction. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, wailed in regret. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order catastrophe to destroy my people? The gods wept. They sat huddled and weeping, their lips pressed shut. They had destroyed their own creation, and the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of extinction. But then, on the 7th day, the waters began to recede. The boat came to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis opened a window and looked out. Nothing. Silence. Desolation. He released a dove. It flew out and found nowhere. To land. It returned. He released a swallow. It too returned. Finally he released a raven. The raven did not come back. It had found carrion, dry land, the beginning of a new world. Atrahasis stepped out. He built an altar. He offered a sacrifice. The smell of roasting meat rose into the air, and the gods, who had been starving since humanity's extinction, smelled it and gathered around the offering like flies, desperate, humbled, filled with regret. Enlil arrived and saw the boat, saw the survivors, and flew into a rage. How did any man escape? No human was to survive. But Enki stepped forward. He defended his decision. He reminded Enlil that humanity was not the problem. The problem was imbalance. Instead of total annihilation, he proposed regulation. Disease, yes, but not total plague. Predators, yes, but not overwhelming famine. Sterility in some, abundance in others. Balance. Enlil, defeated and perhaps shamed, agreed. He blessed Atrahasis. He granted him and his wife a kind of immortality, a place beyond the mortal world. Humanity was allowed to survive. But the relationship between gods and mortals had changed forever. Humanity was no longer just workers. We were survivors. And the gods were no longer omnipotent. They were regretful, fallible, bound by consequences they had not foreseen. This is the story the Sumerians told, and in almost every detail it predates the biblical account. The dove, the raven, the ark, the measurements, the mountain, the sacrifice, the divine regret. It's all there, preserved in clay 1,000 years before Genesis was written. But there are differences, crucial differences, and those differences may reveal what was changed and why. In Genesis, the flood is a moral judgment. God sends it because humanity is wicked. The narrative is simple. Righteousness is rewarded. Sin is punished. Noah is saved because he is good. But in Atrahasis, morality has nothing to do with it. Humanity is destroyed because we are too loud, too numerous, too successful. The flood is not justice. It's population control. A desperate, poorly planned attempt by gods who are themselves flawed and frightened. In Genesis, God is singular, omnipotent, in total control. In Atrahasis, the gods argue, they scheme, they regret, they weep. They are not all-knowing, they make mistakes, and one of them, Enki, directly defies the decree of the council to save humanity. He is a rebel god, a trickster, a protector of human knowledge and survival. In later Hebrew tradition, this role, the serpent who brings forbidden knowledge, the rebel angel who opposes divine authority, becomes villainized. But in the Sumerian version, Enki is the hero, the savior of the species. The other major difference is the details themselves. Genesis is vague. The ark is described in rough dimensions. The animals are simply 2 of every kind. The duration is simplified to 40 days and nights. But the Sumerian versions are precise. They specify materials, construction techniques, animal husbandry protocols, the exact sequence of birds released. These are the marks of an eyewitness account, not a parable. It reads like a survival manual passed down by people who actually lived through something and wanted future generations to know exactly what happened and how to survive if it happened again. And that brings us to the oldest version of all, not Atrahasis, not Gilgamesh, but the Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary Sumerian text from around 2300 BCE, possibly copying from sources even older. In this version, the flood survivor is named Ziusudra, meaning life of long days. He's described as a pious king who listens carefully to divine instructions. The story is damaged, incomplete, but the structure is the same. The gods decide to flood the earth. Enki warns Ziusudra through a reed wall. Ziusudra builds a vessel. The flood lasts 7 days and nights. Afterwards, Ziusudra is granted eternal life. What is haunting about the Eridu Genesis is its tone. It is not mythological in the way we think of myth. It is historical. It reads like a chronicle, a record of something that happened. And the Sumerians treated it that way. Ziusudra was listed in the Sumerian king list, the same list that recorded the reigns of historical kings like Gilgamesh and Ur-Nammu. His reign is placed before the flood, and after him the list says explicitly, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, kingship was lowered again from heaven. This is not metaphor. To the Sumerians, the flood was history, an event that divided time. Pre-flood kings reigned for impossible lengths, thousands of years, suggesting either symbolic or misunderstood records. Post-flood kings reigned for normal human lifespans. Something happened, something that reset civilization. And the survivors remembered it, recorded it, preserved it in every way they could, because to forget would be to lose the most important truth they possessed, that humanity had nearly ended, and that we were saved, not by our own power, but by knowledge. Knowledge given, whispered through a reed wall, carried aboard a vessel, and passed down through clay tablets so that we would never forget. And here is where the story stops being ancient and becomes urgent. Because if the Sumerians were recording a real event, if the flood narratives are fragmented memories of an actual catastrophe, then what caused it? And could it happen again? Geological studies of Mesopotamia have revealed evidence of massive flooding events around 2900 BCE, roughly coinciding with the transition between the Uruk and early dynastic periods. Sediment layers show sudden inundation across wide areas. Settlements were abandoned. Populations migrated. Some researchers suggest a catastrophic breach of natural dams, a meteor impact in the Indian Ocean, or the rapid melting of glacial ice at the end of the Younger Dryas period, around 9600 BCE, a much earlier date that aligns disturbingly well with flood myths across dozens of other cultures worldwide. The Sumerian texts do not describe a local river flood. They describe water from above and below, a cosmic event, something that involved the heavens and the deep simultaneously. This matches descriptions of a mega tsunami, a comet impact, or sudden crustal displacement, something so vast that it appeared, to those who survived, as though the gods themselves had torn the world apart. And if that is true, if embedded within these myths is the memory of a real global or near-global cataclysm, then the Sumerian tablets are not just literature. They are testimony, the last written words of a world that drowned, preserved by those who escaped, copied and recopied across millennia because the survivors understood something we have forgotten. That catastrophe is not ancient history. It is cyclical. And the knowledge of how to survive, how to rebuild, how to preserve what matters most, That knowledge must be passed down, encoded, repeated, or it will be lost when the waters rise again. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends with the hero returning to Uruk empty-handed. He did not achieve immortality, but he did something else. He carved his story into stone, he recorded what he learned, and the text closes with an instruction. Go, inspect the foundation of Uruk, examine the brickwork, see that it is made of kiln-fired brick, read the inscriptions, remember what came before, because that is the real message of the flood stories. Not that gods punished us, but that civilizations fall, that knowledge can be lost, that survival depends on memory, and that the greatest act of devotion we can offer to the future is this: to write down what we know, to preserve it in the most durable form we can find, and to trust that someone someday will dig it up and remember what we tried so desperately not to forget, that the world ended once, and that we survived. The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents ever pressed into clay. It reads like history. It follows the conventions of chronicle and record. City names, king names, reign lengths, dynasties rising and falling in orderly succession. And yet, when you reach the opening lines, something breaks. The numbers stop making sense, not because they're wrong, but because they're impossible. The list begins with a simple declaration. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names the first king Alulim and records his reign, 86,400 years. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. Then Enmenluana for 43,200. 8 kings in total, ruling from 5 cities before the flood. The combined length of their reigns? 241,200 years. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these numbers as mythological inflation, symbolic rather than literal, representations of legitimacy rather than actual time. The ancient mind, they argue, did not distinguish between history and myth the way we do. Long reign signified divine favour, nothing more. And yet, the Sumerians who recorded these figures were the same people who calculated the synodic cycle of Venus to the day, who measured the Earth's axial precession across millennia, who standardized weights and measures with obsessive precision. They understood numbers, they worshipped accuracy, so why would they suddenly abandon rigor when recording their own origins, unless they weren't abandoning it, unless they were recording something else? Something that required numbers we can no longer interpret because the framework has been lost. The king list does not treat the antediluvian period as legend. It treats it as fact. The reigns are numbered, the cities are named, the sequence is clear, and then, abruptly, the text pauses. A single line breaks the rhythm. Then the flood swept over. And after that line, everything changes. The numbers drop. Post-flood kings reign for hundreds of years, then decades, then lifetimes recognizable as human, as though something fundamental had shifted, as though mortality itself had been reset. But the king list is not the only document that speaks of the time before. Scattered across dozens of tablets, buried in temple archives from Uruk to Nippur, are references to the Apkallu, the 7 sages, the wise ones who came before the flood and brought the knowledge of civilization to humanity. They are not described as gods, though they serve the gods. They are not quite human, though they teach humans. They exist in a liminal space, intermediaries between heaven and earth, possessing knowledge that should not yet exist. Each of the Apkallu is named. Wana, also called Adapa, the first and wisest, Waneduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, Utuabzu. 7 figures, 7 cities, 7 transmissions of divine knowledge. The tablets say they emerge from the sea, from the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the world where Enki kept his sanctuary. They were sent to teach humanity the me, the sacred codes of civilization, before the coming disaster. The Apkallu taught writing, they taught mathematics, They laid out the first cities according to celestial alignments. They instructed priests in ritual, farmers in irrigation, smiths in metallurgy. They brought the plans for temples, the formulas for medicine, the star charts for navigation. Everything humanity would need not to invent civilization, but to preserve it, because that is what the texts suggest over and over in fragments and hymns and king lists. Civilization was not born in Sumer, it was remembered. And the cities themselves, the 5 antediluvian cities named in the king list, were not settlements in the way we understand the term. They were focal points, sacred centres where knowledge was concentrated, where the connection between heaven and earth was strongest. Eridu, the oldest, the first city where kingship descended from heaven. Bad Tibira, the city of metal workers, where bronze and copper were first refined. Larak, the cult centre of the sun god. Sippar, the city of scribes and astronomers, where tablets were kept in the temple of Shamash, god of justice and light. And Shuruppak, the last city, the place where Ziusudra, the flood hero, ruled as king and priest before the waters came. Each city was associated with a different aspect of knowledge. Each one preserved a different part of the me. It was as though the antediluvian world had organized itself not around resources or defense, but around the preservation and transmission of information. A global network of knowledge centers, each one holding a fragment of the whole, so that if one fell, the others could remember. And then there is the knowledge itself. The tablets are explicit. Advanced astronomy was already established before the flood. The calculation of planetary orbits, the tracking of eclipses, the measurement of precession. These were not discoveries made in post-flood Sumer. They were inheritances. The astronomical texts do not describe a process of learning. They describe a process of recovery. As it was in the days before the deluge, the scribes wrote, copying star charts from older tablets, preserving cycles that predated their civilization by thousands of years. The same is true of mathematics, geometric formulas, algebraic methods, the base 60 number system that would later be adopted by Babylon and still survives today in our measurement of time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary. They are remnants of a system so old we have forgotten why it was chosen, but so functional we have never replaced it. Agricultural knowledge, too, was attributed to the antediluvian period. The domestication of wheat and barley, the engineering of irrigation canals, the synchronization of planting cycles with lunar phases and solar positions. Knowledge that should require centuries of trial and error, yet appears in the earlier Sumerian records already complete, already optimized, as though someone had simply written down what they already knew. But the tablets do not only describe what the antediluvians knew, they also describe why that world ended, and here the story becomes darker, more unsettling. Because the gods, according to the text, did not destroy humanity out of cruelty or caprice. They destroyed it out of necessity. The world before the flood had become intolerable, not because of wickedness in the moral sense, but because of noise. The word used in the Atrahasis epic is rigmu, clamour, uproar. The sound of too many people living too densely, the hum of civilization grown so loud it disturbed the sleep of the gods. Humanity had multiplied beyond control. Cities sprawled, populations exploded, the earth groaned under the weight of human presence, and Enlil, king of the gods, could no longer rest. The tablets describe his frustration, his rage, his decision to wipe the earth clean not because humanity had sinned, but because it had succeeded too well. It had grown too numerous, too noisy, too alive. It's a strange justification for apocalypse, overpopulation, noise pollution, not moral failure, but ecological collapse, as though the gods were not divine judges but custodians of balance, and humanity in its pre-flood abundance had tipped the scales too far. But there was another problem, darker still, woven through the myths like a forbidden thread. the texts speak cautiously of interbreeding, of divine beings descending to earth and taking human partners. The offspring of these unions were called by different names in different traditions. In Sumerian texts, they are sometimes called the Mighty Ones, warriors of renown, figures of great size and strength. In later Hebrew texts compiled from traditions that echo the Sumerian originals, they are called the Nephilim, the Fallen Ones, giants who walked the earth before the flood and became legends afterward. The tablets do not celebrate these unions. They describe them as transgressions, boundary violations. The divine and the mortal were not meant to mix. When they did, something broke. A corruption spread not through wickedness, but through incompatibility. The offspring were too powerful, too long-lived, too knowledgeable. They possessed abilities that should have remained in heaven. They taught forbidden arts, weaponry, sorcery, the secrets of the heavens and the depths of the earth. And humanity, acquiring knowledge it was not ready to wield, began to fracture under the weight of it. Enlil saw this. He saw the noise, the overpopulation, the blurring of boundaries between divine and human, and he made his decision. The flood would come, not as punishment, but as reset, a way to restore balance, to silence the clamour, to erase the corruption and begin again with a smaller, quieter, more manageable humanity. But Enki, the god of wisdom, did not agree. Enki, who had given humanity the me, who had taught the Apkallu, who valued knowledge above order, chose to intervene. He could not stop the flood. The other gods had decided, but he could save a remnant. A single man, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. A man who would preserve not only human life, but human knowledge, the knowledge that must not be lost. The instructions Enki gave were precise. Build a boat, seal it with bitumen, bring seeds of every plant, bring animals of every kind, but also, and this is whispered through the texts, bring the tablets, bring the knowledge, the astronomical charts, the mathematical formulas, the medical texts, the records of the me, because the flood would destroy the cities, the temples, the libraries, but if the knowledge could be carried through the waters, civilization could be rebuilt on the other side. This is what the Sumerians believed, that the wisdom encoded in their tablets was not discovered after the flood, it was saved through it, carried aboard the ark not as myth, but as data. And when the waters receded, when the survivors stumbled onto dry land, they did not start from zero. They started from memory, partial, fragmented, corrupted by water and time, but still there, still recoverable. And this pattern, this story of a pre-flood world destroyed for growing too advanced, too noisy, too transgressive, appears not only in Sumerian texts, it echoes across the ancient world. The Hebrew Bible describes the same sequence in Genesis. The Nephilim, the interbreeding, the wickedness, the flood, the single righteous man chosen to survive. The Vedic texts of India speak of the Pralaya, the great dissolution, a flood that ended the previous age of the world. The Greeks remembered Deucalion, who survived a deluge sent by Zeus to punish humanity's corruption. The Mayans recorded multiple cycles of creation and destruction, worlds ending in flood and fire. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin, preserve flood stories in which knowledge bearers survive and teach the new world how to live. How could such consistency emerge unless it pointed to something real? Not necessarily a single global flood, though geological evidence of catastrophic flooding at the end of the last ice age continues to accumulate, but perhaps a memory, a cultural memory of a time before, a world that rose higher than ours and fell harder, a civilization that knew too much, grew too fast and paid the price. The Sumerians did not romanticize the antediluvian world. They remembered it with ambivalence. It was a time of wonders, yes, a time when the gods walked among men, when the Apkallu brought sacred knowledge, when kings ruled for thousands of years and cities shone with the light of heaven. But it was also a time of imbalance, a time when boundaries were crossed, when humanity reached for powers it could not control, when the noise of civilization grew so loud that silence could only be restored through catastrophe. And perhaps that is the real warning encoded in the tablets. Not that the flood was divine punishment for sin, but that it was the inevitable result of excess, of knowledge without wisdom, of growth without restraint, of a world that climbed too high and forgot to build foundations strong enough to hold it. The Sumerians, rising from the mud of the flood's aftermath, understood this. They understood that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost in a single generation if it is not written down, repeated, ritualized, preserved. That the difference between flourishing and extinction is not strength or righteousness, but memory, the ability to carry forward what came before, to learn from the ruins, to remember. And so they pressed, their wedges into clay. They recorded the king list. They copied the astronomical tables. They hymned the Apkallu. They preserved every fragment they could recover from the world before, not because they wanted to rebuild it exactly, but because they knew that without those fragments they would have nothing to build on at all. The antediluvian world, according to the tablets, was real. It was advanced, it was flawed, and it drowned. But its knowledge survived, encoded in formulas, embedded in rituals, whispered through the ages in the language of the scribes. The Sumerians were not the first civilization. They were the second, the inheritors, the rememberers, the ones who carried the light through the dark water and kindled it again on the other side. And if they could do it once, perhaps we can do it again. Perhaps we are meant to. The flood did not come as a surprise, not to everyone. According to the Sumerian tablets, there was a warning, a deliberate act of intervention that saved not just one man and his family, but the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization. The story appears across multiple sources, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, fragments preserved in Nippur and later Babylonian recensions. Each version differs in detail, but the core narrative remains consistent. The gods decided to destroy humanity. One god disagreed, and in secret he gave instructions for survival. In the Sumerian account, the survivor's name was Ziusudra, meaning he who saw life, or he of long days. In the Akkadian version, he becomes Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. In Babylonian tradition, Utnapishtim, he who found life. The names change, but the role remains the same, a righteous man, a king or priest, chosen to preserve what mattered most. And the god who chose him was Enki, lord of the Abzu, keeper of the Emi, patron of wisdom, craftsman and forbidden knowledge. Enki, who had created humanity in the first place. The tablets describe the moment of warning with startling intimacy. Enki did not appear directly. To do so would violate the decree of the assembly, where Enlil, the chief god, had commanded the destruction of mankind. So instead, Enki spoke to a wall. He stood beside the reed hut where Ziusudra slept, and whispered his instructions to the structure itself, allowing the man inside to overhear. A technicality, a loophole, divine rebellion disguised as coincidence. The words that passed through that wall were not vague prophecies, they were technical specifications. Tear down your house, Enki said. Build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, reject property and save living things. The boat you will build, her dimensions shall be equal, her width and length shall be the same. Roof her over like the Abzu. Equal dimensions, a cube or a square-hulled vessel, designed not for navigation, but for stability. A structure meant to survive, not to steer. The comparison to the Abzu is critical. The Abzu was Enki's realm, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the source of all springs, rivers and wells. It was not chaos, it was order, deep, ancient and unchanging. To roof the vessel like the Abzu was to make it a sealed container, a preservation chamber, something that could endure submersion in a world turned entirely to water. Other tablets provide additional details. Ziusudra was instructed to coat the interior and exterior with bitumen, a tar-like substance abundant in Mesopotamia, waterproofing that would prevent even the smallest leak. He was to divide the interior into compartments, sections for animals, for supplies, for his family, and for something else. Something the tablets call the seed of all living things. Not just biological seeds, but knowledge, tablets, scrolls, the Emi themselves. The boat was not merely an ark, it was a library, a genetic and intellectual vault designed to carry civilization across the boundary of annihilation. And then the flood began. The Atrahasis epic describes it with a precision that feels less like mythology and more like eyewitness testimony. Ansu was tearing at the sky with his talons. The land was shattered like a pot. Anzu, the lion-headed eagle, storm incarnate. The image is not symbolic. It describes atmospheric violence, the sky ripping apart, air pressure collapsing, the kind of disturbance that precedes a cataclysm. The Eridu-genesis adds another layer. The great gods made the windstorm blow. The flood came. Its power descended on the people like a battle. Not rain, not rising rivers. A wall of water descending sudden and total, as though the sky itself had collapsed. The tablets specify the duration. 7 days and 7 nights. Not 40, as in the later Hebrew account. 7. A number sacred to the Sumerians, tied to the cycles of the moon, the visible planets, the structure of time itself. Whether literal or symbolic, the message is clear. The flood was complete, absolute. By the time it ended, the world had been erased. The Gilgamesh version, drawing from older Sumerian sources, expands the description. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind blew, the downpour, the tempest, and the flood overwhelmed the land. On the 7th day, the tempest, the flood, which had waged war like an army, subsided in its assault. The sea grew calm, the windstorm died, the flood ceased, and then silence, the kind of silence that follows annihilation. Utnapishtim, the Babylonian name for the flood hero, opens a hatch and looks out. I looked at the sea. All was silence, and all of mankind had returned to clay. That phrase, return to clay, it echoes through every version of the story, a recognition that humanity, formed from clay by the gods, had dissolved back into the substance of its origin. The flood had undone creation itself, but the vessel survived, and when the waters began to recede, it came to rest on a mountain. The Sumerian tablets call it Mount Nisir, Mountain of Salvation. Later, Babylonian sources preserve the same name. The Hebrew Bible, drawing from these older traditions, calls it Ararat. But Mount Nisir is not mythical, it is real. A peak in the Zagros mountain range northeast of Mesopotamia, in what is now Kurdistan, part of modern-day Iraq and Iran. Archaeologists and geographers have identified it with reasonable confidence as Pir Omar Gudrun, a mountain that rises over 9,000 feet, high enough to be among the first places to emerge as floodwaters receded across the Mesopotamian plain. This is not allegory. The Sumerians named a specific location, a place that exists, that fits the geography of the region, and that would logically serve as a refuge in the event of catastrophic flooding. They even describe what happened next with procedural clarity. Ziusudra sent out birds, a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven. The dove returned. The swallow returned. The raven did not. It found dry land, carrion, food. The test was complete. The world was habitable again. And here is where the Sumerian account diverges sharply from the later biblical narrative. In Genesis, Noah exits the ark, offers a sacrifice, and receives God's covenant. A promise never to flood the earth again, sealed by the rainbow. It is a moment of reconciliation, divine regret, a new beginning. But the Sumerian version is colder, more political, more honest about what survival actually meant. Ziusudra does make an offering. He sacrifices oxen and sheep. The gods, who have been absent during the flood, suddenly appear. The tablets say they gathered around the sacrifice like flies, drawn by the smell of roasting meat. They were hungry. This detail is shocking in its implications. The gods needed humanity, not for worship in some abstract sense, but for sustenance, for labour, for offerings. By destroying mankind, they had destroyed their own support system. Enlil, the god who had decreed the flood, arrives and is furious to discover that anyone survived. No man was to live through the destruction, he roars, but Enki confronts him. It was not I who revealed the secret. The exceedingly wise man, he perceived it himself. Another technicality, another loophole. Enki did not break the decree. Ziusudra simply overheard. The argument that follows is not about morality or justice. It is about utility. Enki does not say humans deserve to live. He argues that they are necessary, that total destruction was a strategic error, that the gods need someone to work the fields, maintain the temples, and perform the rituals. Eventually Enlil concedes. He grants Ziusudra and his wife immortality and relocates them to Dilmun, the land of the living, a distant paradise where the flood hero will dwell forever, removed from mortal time, but also removed from the world he saved. It is not a reward. It is exile. Ziusudra preserved civilization, but he would not be part of its rebuilding. This political dimension, the friction between gods, the pragmatic rather than moral resolution, suggests something deeper. If these stories encode historical memory, then the gods may represent factions, kingdoms, or ruling classes with competing interests. Enlil, associated with wind, storms, and kingship, represents destructive power, the force that imposes order through violence. Enki, associated with water, wisdom, and craft, represents preservation, the force that values knowledge and continuity. The flood, then, was not just a natural disaster. It was a decision, a policy enacted and narrowly subverted. And here is where mythology and science begin to converge, because there is evidence, physical, geological, undeniable evidence that something catastrophic happened in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur. He dug down through layers of occupation, pottery, tools, ash, the accumulated debris of human habitation, and then, suddenly, nothing. A thick stratum of clean, water-laid clay, over 8 feet deep in some places, containing no artifacts, no structures, no signs of life. Below that layer, more artifacts, older settlements, evidence of an earlier culture abruptly buried. Woolley famously declared, "We have found the flood." Other sites across Mesopotamia, Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak, revealed similar deposits, layers of silt interrupting the archaeological record dating to roughly the same period. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but consistently enough to suggest an event of extraordinary scale. A deluge that inundated the river valleys, buried entire cities, and created a boundary in time that survivors would remember for millennia. But what caused it? The Tigris and Euphrates flood regularly. Seasonal inundation was a fact of life in ancient Mesopotamia, both threat and blessing. But this was different. The clay layers suggest something far more catastrophic, a flood that lasted not hours or days, but long enough to deposit multiple feet of sediment, to completely submerge settlements, to force populations to flee or perish. Some geologists point to a combination of factors: unusually heavy rainfall, snowmelt from the mountains, possibly a storm surge from the Persian Gulf if a massive cyclone pushed seawater inland. All of these occurring simultaneously could produce the kind of deluge described in the tablets. But there is another hypothesis, more radical, more geographically distant, yet strange in how well it fits the timeline. the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. In the 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that around 5600 BCE, the Black Sea, then a freshwater lake, was catastrophically flooded when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus Strait. The result was a waterfall of unimaginable scale, pouring seawater into the basin at a rate 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, raising the lake level by hundreds of feet, submerging thousands of square miles of coastline, displacing entire populations. The date doesn't match the Mesopotamian flood deposits, but here's the question. What if there were multiple floods? What if the Black Sea catastrophe created a diaspora of refugees who carried the memory south into Anatolia, into the Caucasus, and eventually into Mesopotamia? And what if centuries later, when another great flood struck the river valleys, that older memory merged with the new trauma, creating a composite narrative, a story that preserved both events, the ancestral deluge and the local disaster, woven together into a single mythic framework? Recent studies of ancient DNA support large-scale migrations into Mesopotamia during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, populations moving south from Anatolia and the Caucasus, bringing with them new technologies, new languages, and perhaps new stories. If those migrants carried flood myths from the Black Sea region, and if their descendants later experienced the Mesopotamian floods of 2900 BCE, the fusion of memories would be inevitable. The result would be exactly what we see in the tablets, a detailed, geographically specific account of a Mesopotamian event, layered with older, more primal imagery of divine wrath and world-ending water. Or perhaps there is another explanation, one that doesn't require multiple events or migrating populations. Perhaps the flood the Sumerians described was not meteorological at all. In 2020, researchers analysing sediment cores from the Persian Gulf identified evidence of rapid sea level rise during the early Holocene, the period when glaciers were melting at the end of the last ice age. Between 8000 and 6000 BCE, global sea levels rose by as much as 120 meters. For low-lying coastal regions, this was apocalyptic. The Persian Gulf itself was once dry land, a river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates converged. As the ocean rose, it swallowed that valley, pushing salt water inland, flooding settlements, transforming geography. Could the Sumerian flood be a memory of that older transformation, preserved across millennia through oral tradition until it was finally written down? If so, then the tablets are not recording an event from 2900 BCE. They're recording something far older, something that happened when the world was still emerging from ice, when coastlines shifted, when the map of the earth was being rewritten by rising seas. A memory so deep, so foundational, that every civilization that came after treated it as the dividing line between the old world and the new. This would explain why the flood story is not unique to Sumer. The Hebrew Noah, the Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Manu, the Chinese Gunyu, the Mesoamerican Coxcox. Over 200 cultures worldwide preserve flood myths, stories of a great deluge, a chosen survivor, a vessel, and a new beginning. Mainstream scholars attribute this to the universality of flooding as a natural disaster. Every river valley floods, every coastal settlement faces storms. Of course, floods appear in mythology. But the details are too consistent, the structure too similar, the theological framework, divine decision, human wickedness, selective survival, covenant or transformation afterward repeats across continents and millennia, perhaps because it was not invented independently, perhaps because the memory is older than civilization itself, a genuine historical event massive enough to be remembered by scattered populations as they migrated, settled, and eventually developed writing. And the Sumerians, because they were the first to write it down, became the keepers of the most detailed account, the version closest to the original event. But here is what the tablets make undeniably clear, and what later adaptations often obscure. The flood was not punishment for sin in the biblical sense. The Sumerians do not describe humanity as wicked or corrupt. They describe humanity as noisy. Too many people, too much activity. The gods could not sleep. Enlil, disturbed by the clamour of civilization, decided to reduce the population. First through plague, then through drought, then through famine, and when none of these worked, through flood. It was population control, resource management, and ecological correction. This makes the story feel less mythic and more historical. Because this is how societies actually collapse. Not through moral failure, but through overpopulation, resource depletion, environmental stress. The Sumerian account preserves that logic. It remembers not just the flood, but the conditions that preceded it, the rising tension, the failures of the gods to manage the problem without total destruction, and the last-minute intervention that saved just enough knowledge to start again. And so Ziusudra survived. The vessel landed, the birds were released, the sacrifice was made, and the gods, humbled by their own hunger, realized they could not afford to destroy humanity completely. What happens next? How civilization was rebuilt? Who taught the survivors? And what knowledge was recovered from the wreckage? That is the next chapter. But the flood itself, the event that divided time, that created a before and after in human memory, that inscribed itself so deeply into consciousness that every culture that followed would remember it, that was real. Not metaphor, not allegory. Real. The water came. The world drowned. And someone, against all odds, remembered. When the waters finally receded, when the bodies stopped floating and the sky cleared enough to see the stars again, what remained? According to the tablets, not emptiness, not silence, but a choice. A moment suspended between annihilation and restoration when the gods themselves stood at a threshold, uncertain whether humanity deserved a second chance. The Sumerian king list records what happened next with brutal simplicity. Quote, "After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. No explanation, no transition, just this. The world ended, and then it began again." But between those two statements lies something far more complex than resettlement or repopulation. What the tablets preserve across multiple versions, across centuries of retelling, is the story of a covenant, an agreement forged in the aftermath of catastrophe between those who survived and those who had caused the deluge in the first place. In the Atrahasis epic, after the flood, after Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, the flood hero, makes his offering of thanksgiving, the gods gather to decide the future of humanity, and they are divided. Enlil, the god who decreed the flood, is still enraged that humans survived at all. He storms into the assembly, demanding to know who defied his will, who warned the mortals, who allowed the bloodline to continue. Enki steps forward. He does not apologize. Instead, he speaks. And what he says changes everything. He argues that the destruction was excessive, that humanity's crime, their noise, their multiplication, did not warrant extinction. He proposes instead a new order, a world where human population would be naturally limited, where death would claim some before they could reproduce, where balance would be maintained not through cataclysm, but through the ordinary sorrows of mortal existence, disease, miscarriage, infertility, predation, the natural checks that keep a species from overwhelming its environment. It's a chilling solution, but Enlil accepts it, and in that acceptance, a covenant is formed. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but under new terms. The age of immortality was over. The pre-flood kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years would be replaced by mortals whose lives flickered and faded within a single century. The direct communion with the divine, the unmediated access to the gods that characterized the antediluvian world, would become rare, reserved for priests and kings, mediated through ritual and sacrifice. Humanity would no longer live alongside the gods. They would live beneath them, subjects rather than companions. And in exchange for their survival, they would bear the responsibility of maintaining what had been saved. The knowledge, the cities, the sacred formulas, the me that Enki had preserved and passed to the flood hero before the waters came. Because here is what the tablets make clear, what mainstream archaeology struggles to reconcile. The knowledge did not drown. Somehow, impossibly, the core elements of Sumerian civilization, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, the architecture, the agricultural techniques, all of it survived the flood intact. Not as fragments, not as dim memories slowly pieced together over generations, but as complete systems ready to be redeployed, as though someone had carefully archived the entire blueprint of civilization and carried it through the deluge, in a vessel as carefully protected as the animals and the seed. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives, explicitly states that Enki instructed Yasudra to preserve not just his family, but the me, the divine codes of civilization, the formulas and principles that governed everything from kingship to metallurgy. The Ark, in this telling, was not merely a lifeboat. It was a library, a genetic vault, a time capsule containing everything necessary to rebuild. And rebuild they did, with startling speed. The Sumerian king list divides history into two epochs, antediluvian and post-diluvian, before the flood and after. The difference is stark. Before the flood, kings reigned for implausible spans. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alangar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. These are not human lifespans. They are epochs, ages, durations that suggest either mythic exaggeration, a different calendar system, or something else entirely. Dynasties that lasted not generations but geological timescales. And then the flood. And after the flood, the numbers change. Dramatically. The first post-diluvian king, Gusha of Kish, reigns for 1,200 years. Still extraordinary by modern standards, but a fraction of what came before. His successor, Kulassi-Nabel, 900 years. The next, 600. Within a few generations, the reign lengths drop into the hundreds, then the decades, settling finally into the range of ordinary human mortality. By the time of the historical kings, the ones we can verify through archaeology, Gilgamesh, Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, the reigns last 20, 30, maybe 50 years. Normal, mortal, finite. What happened? The tablets offer no scientific explanation, no discussion of genetic degradation or environmental collapse. They simply record the transition as though it were inevitable. The age of the gods had ended. Humanity had entered the age of men. And yet, something lingered. Something was preserved. Because despite the shortening of lifespans, despite the new fragility of human existence, the post-diluvian Sumerians did not start from scratch. They rebuilt their cities in the exact same locations as the antediluvian settlements. Eridu, the first city where kingship descended from heaven, was refounded on the ruins of its pre-flood incarnation. Excavations at the site reveal multiple layers of occupation, separated by a distinct stratum of water-laid silt, evidence of catastrophic flooding. Below the silt, temples and kilns. Above it, temples and kilns again, built to the same design, oriented to the same cardinal directions, using the same architectural proportions, as though the survivors returned to the drowned cities, dug through the mud, and used the old foundations as templates. The same pattern appears at Ur, at Uruk, at Shuruppak, at Nippur. Each site shows continuity of form across the flood, boundary. The post-flood structures are not primitive attempts to imitate lost grandeur. They are precise replications, executed with a level of skill that suggests the knowledge was never truly lost, only interrupted. And it wasn't just architecture. The agricultural techniques described in post-Diluvian texts, the irrigation formulas, the planting calendars aligned to celestial events, all of it matches the systems referenced in pre-flood contexts. The metallurgical knowledge, the precise copper to tin ratios for bronze, appears fully formed in the post-Diluvian period with no learning curve, no trial and error. The astronomical observations tracking Venus, Jupiter, the precessional wobble, continue uninterrupted as though the scribes simply resumed recording where their ancestors had left off. How? How does a civilization recover this completely, this quickly, unless the recovery was planned? Unless the knowledge was deliberately preserved and intentionally transmitted by those who knew the flood was coming? The tablets answer this directly. Enki warned Ziusudra. He told him to build the ark, yes, but he also told him to preserve the tablets themselves. Some versions of the story describe Ziusudra burying inscribed tablets in Sippar, the city of the sun god, before the flood, so they could be recovered afterward. Other versions suggest he carried copies with him, clay archives wrapped in bitumen, waterproofed and protected, a Sumerian Dead Sea Scrolls preserved through catastrophe. The Greek historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, recorded a Babylonian tradition that claimed all antediluvian knowledge had been buried at Sippar before the flood and dug up afterward, allowing civilization to resume without loss of continuity. Modern archaeology has not found these buried tablets, but the absence of physical evidence does not erase the consistency of the tradition. Every culture in Mesopotamia, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, repeated the same story. Knowledge was saved. The flood did not erase everything. What we have, what we are, is built on what survived, and perhaps that is why post-Diluvian Sumerian civilization advanced so rapidly. Within a few centuries of the flood, by 3500 BCE, Uruk was a thriving metropolis with monumental architecture, advanced irrigation, long-distance trade networks, and a fully developed writing system. There was no slow climb from primitive subsistence to urban complexity. The Sumerians emerged from the flood already possessing the tools of civilization, already literate, already organized, already in possession of the me. They did not invent these things, they remembered them. Or more precisely, they were taught them by those who remembered. Because according to the tablets, the post-Diluvian world was not left entirely to human initiative. The gods, having decided to allow humanity's survival, did not simply abandon them to figure everything out alone. Instead, certain individuals were chosen, appointed, granted access to divine knowledge so they could serve as conduits between heaven and earth. The Me priests, the Ien, the Lugal, the shepherd kings who ruled not by conquest, but by divine appointment. These figures were said to possess ishib, wisdom, a term that connoted not intelligence, but access. They were the ones who could still hear the gods, who could interpret omens, who could perform the rituals that maintained cosmic order, and they were the ones entrusted with preserving and transmitting the knowledge that had survived the flood. This is why Sumerian kings repeatedly invoke pre-flood wisdom as the source of their authority. Inscriptions from Ur-Nammu, from Shulgi, from Hammurabi, all reference the Me, the divine ordinances given by Enki, preserved through the flood, and passed down through the priestly lineages. They do not claim to have discovered new truths. They claim to have recovered old ones, to have restored what had been interrupted. Hammurabi's law code, one of the oldest legal documents in history, does not present itself as innovation. The stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the sun god, but the prologue makes clear that these laws are restorations, not inventions, a return to the justice that governed the world before chaos came. When Anu and Enlil determined the destinies of the land, they gave kingship to Marduk, they pronounced the lofty name of Babylon, they made it supreme in the world, and in its midst they established for him an everlasting kingship, whose foundations are as firm as heaven and earth. The language is unambiguous. Authority flows downward from the gods, through appointed intermediaries, preserving an order that predates human history. This narrative, this way of understanding civilization as inherited rather than invented, as recovered rather than discovered, permeates not just Sumerian thought, but every culture that came after. The Akkadians, who conquered Sumer around 2300 BCE, adopted the flood story wholesale. They translated Atrahasis into their own language, preserving the covenant, the me, the role of Enki as preserver of knowledge. The Babylonians inherited it next, weaving it into the Enuma Elish, their creation epic, and later into the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero, now called Utnapishtim, recounts the deluge to Gilgamesh himself, proving that the memory had been passed down intact for over a millennium. The Assyrians carried it further north, inscribing flood hymns on the walls of Nineveh, and eventually the Hebrews, living in Babylonian exile, absorbed the story and transformed it, stripping away the polytheism, replacing Enki and Enlil with Yahweh, replacing Ziusudra with Noah, but keeping the core structure. A righteous man warned by God, a flood that destroys the world, a covenant made afterward, a promise that it would never happen again, and a new order established on the terms of the divine. The biblical flood is not a separate tradition. It is the Sumerian flood story filtered through monotheism, passed down through 2,000 years of oral and written transmission, a testament to the durability of the memory. And within that memory, encoded in every version, is the same insistence. Civilization is fragile. Knowledge can be lost. What we have was given, not earned, and the responsibility to preserve it, to pass it forward, to ensure that the next generation does not have to start from zero, that responsibility is sacred. It is the condition of our survival. The covenant made after the flood was not just about population control or divine restraint. It was about stewardship. Humanity was allowed to continue, but only if they remembered. Only if they honored the knowledge, maintained the temples, performed the rituals, recorded the stars, taught the formulas, and passed the me forward intact. This is why the Sumerians obsessed over record-keeping, why they carved their king lists, their hymns, their astronomical tables into clay that could survive fire and flood and time. They were not being poetic, they were being practical. They had seen what happens when knowledge is lost. They had lived through it, or at least their ancestors had. And they were determined, absolutely determined, never to let it happen again. Every tablet pressed into clay was an act of defiance against forgetting. Every scribe trained in the E-Dubber, the tablet house, was a guardian of continuity. Every temple that preserved the old hymns in the old language was a fortress against the silence that follows catastrophe. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of the flood story, not the event itself, but the lesson learned in its aftermath. That civilization is not inevitable, that progress is not guaranteed, that everything we build, everything we know, can be swept away if we are not vigilant. The gods, in the Sumerian telling, did not promise that it would never happen again. They promised only that they would not cause it, but the implication was clear. Humanity could still destroy itself, through hubris, through neglect, through forgetting the covenant and the knowledge it was meant to protect. The flood was a warning, and the rebuilding was a test. Could humanity be trusted with a second chance? Could they learn from the catastrophe? Could they preserve what had been saved and pass it forward, generation after generation, without losing the thread? The Sumerians believed they could. They had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. To forget was to drown again, not in water, but in ignorance, in chaos, in the collapse that comes when the formulas are lost, and the stars go unread, and the me dissolve back into the Abzu, waiting for someone else someday to pull them out again. And so they wrote, they recorded, they remembered, and they left behind, in clay and stone, the story of what happened when the world ended and how it began again. Not from nothing, but from what was saved. And so we return from the depths of ancient clay and wedge-shaped script to stand in our own present moment, surrounded by satellites and supercomputers, armed with instruments the Sumerians could never have imagined, and yet haunted by the same question that echoed through Uruk and Eridu 5,000 years ago. What came before, and what was lost? The difference is this. We are no longer merely reading their answers, we are beginning to confirm them. In 2000, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman published findings that sent ripples through the archaeological community. Using sonar imaging and sediment core samples from the Black Sea floor, they discovered evidence of a catastrophic flooding event dated to approximately 5,600 BCE. The Black Sea, they concluded, had once been a freshwater lake, sitting more than 300 feet below its current level, ringed by Neolithic settlements and fertile valleys. Then something happened. The Mediterranean Sea, swollen by melting glaciers at the end of the Ice Age, breached the natural dam at what is now the Bosporus Strait. Water poured through with the force of 200 Niagara Falls. The lake became a sea. The settlements drowned, and the people who survived fled in all directions, carrying with them stories of a world consumed by water, stories that would echo across cultures and millennia. The flood of Noah, the deluge of Gilgamesh, the Greek tale of Deucalion, the Hindu legend of Manu. All of them perhaps rooted in the same traumatic memory. Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis remains contested. Some geologists argue the flooding was gradual, not catastrophic. Others question the dating. But what cannot be disputed is this. There was a flood, and it was not mythological. It was geological. A real event experienced by real people whose descendants told the story until it became something more than history. It became scripture. And the Black Sea is not the only site. Throughout the past 2 decades, archaeological teams have uncovered evidence of massive flooding events across the ancient world. Submerged ruins off the coast of India near Dwarka and Mahabalipuram. Drowned settlements in the Persian Gulf, where sea levels rose dramatically between 8,000 and 4,000 BCE. Collapsed ice dams in North America that released floods so vast they carved canyons in days, reshaped entire landscapes, and left scars still visible from space. Geologists call them megafloods. Sudden, violent inundations caused by glacial melt, tectonic shifts, or dam failures. Events rare enough to be anomalous, but real enough to be catastrophic, and every one of them would have been experienced by the humans living nearby as the end of the world. Climate science now tells us something the Sumerians already knew. The Earth's climate is not stable, it shifts, it swings, and when it does, entire civilizations can vanish in a single generation. The period between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, the era just before the first city's rise in Mesopotamia, saw some of the most dramatic environmental changes in human history. Global temperatures spiked, ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet, swallowing coastlines, flooding river valleys, submerging what had once been habitable land. If there were cities along those ancient shores, and there is growing evidence to suggest there were, then they're gone now, drowned beneath continental shelves, buried under silt and sediment, lost to a flood that wasn't divine judgment but planetary transition. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. What if the Sumerians were not the first? Mainstream archaeology has long insisted that civilization begins with Sumer, that before 3,500 BCE, humanity existed only in scattered tribes, hunter-gatherers with no writing, no cities, no monumental architecture. The evidence, it was said, simply was not there. But that narrative is crumbling. In 1994, archaeologists discovered Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Massive stone pillars carved with animals and symbols, arranged in circular complexes, built with precision and purpose. The site was dated to 9,600 BCE. more than 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than the first Sumerian cities. It was constructed by people who supposedly had no civilization, no agriculture, no written language, and yet they quarried, transported and erected stones weighing up to 20 tons, aligned them to celestial events, and carved iconography that suggests shared religious symbolism across vast distances. Göbekli Tepe was not an anomaly. Since its discovery, similar sites have been found across the region. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Kori, each one older than the supposed dawn of civilization, each one suggesting a level of organization, cooperation, and knowledge that should not exist according to the established timeline. And then there is the possibility, whispered in the margins of academic papers but rarely spoken aloud, that these sites were not beginnings but endings, that they were built by the survivors of something older, something lost, something drowned. Because here is what the evidence increasingly suggests. Before the flood, before the cities of Sumer, there may have been another world. Not Atlantis in the mythological sense, not a magical utopia, but a network of human settlements along coastlines and river valleys now submerged. Communities that had developed agriculture, architecture, trade, and perhaps even proto-writing. Communities that were erased when the ice melted and the seas rose. And if those communities existed, then the Sumerians were not inventing civilization. They were restoring it. Just as the tablet said, this is not fringe theory. This is the logical conclusion drawn from converging data points. Marine archaeology, climate modelling, and genetic analysis all point in the same direction. Human history is older, more complex, and more fragmented than the textbooks admit. And the stories we dismissed as myth, the flood narratives, the tales of lost knowledge, the memory of gods descending to teach, may be distorted reflections of actual events, not supernatural, not metaphorical, historical. And if that is true, if the Sumerians were recording real memory rather than inventing mythology, then what else might be hidden in those tablets? What other truths are we still too cautious to accept? The implications extend far beyond archaeology. They reach into religion, into philosophy, into the very foundation of how we understand ourselves. The three great Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace their origins back through Mesopotamia. Abraham, the patriarch, came from Ur, a Sumerian city. The Genesis flood narrative mirrors Gilgamesh so closely that scholars now acknowledge direct influence. The concept of divine law written on tablets, Moses descending from Sinai with commandments carved in stone, echoes the Sumerian belief in the me, sacred codes handed down from the gods. Even the structure of monotheism itself, the idea of a single creator deity governing an ordered cosmos, bears the fingerprints of Mesopotamian cosmology. Marduk, Enlil, Anu, each in their time was called the supreme god, the lord of heaven and earth, the one who spoke creation into being. What if the religious history we've been taught is incomplete? What if the God of Abraham was not a radical new revelation, but an evolution, a refinement of much older traditions reaching back to Sumer and beyond? This is not blasphemy. It is archaeology. It is the recognition that sacred texts do not emerge from vacuum. They are written by people living in specific times and places, inheriting stories, symbols and structures from the cultures that came before. To acknowledge this does not diminish faith. It deepens it. It roots the divine in history, in the real struggles of real people trying to make sense of catastrophe, survival, and memory. And there is something else encoded in these tablets, something urgent, something that speaks directly to our own moment. A pattern, a warning, a recognition that civilizations are fragile. The Sumerians lived with the memory of the flood always present. It shaped their literature, their religion, their understanding of kingship and cosmic order. They knew, in a way we're only beginning to remember, that the world can end, that water can rise, that cities can fall, That knowledge can be lost, and so they wrote. Obsessively, compulsively. They pressed their words into clay and baked it hard so that even if everything else burned, even if the rivers changed course, even if the cities crumbled, the knowledge would remain. They were not recording history for themselves. They were recording it for us, for whoever came after. Because they understood what we are, only now relearning. That environmental collapse is not theoretical. It is cyclical, and the warning signs were already visible in their time. The tablets speak of droughts that lasted generations, of rivers that shifted course, of cities abandoned when the water failed. They describe conflicts over irrigation rights, wars triggered by climate stress, populations forced to migrate as farmland turned to dust. These were not mythic events. They were administrative records, economic reports, letters between kings pleading for grain shipments, and they document a pattern that modern climate scientists recognize immediately. Environmental degradation, resource scarcity, societal collapse. The same sequence that has ended civilizations throughout history. The same trajectory we are currently following. The Sumerians survived the flood, but they did not survive forever. By 2000 BCE, their cities were in decline. Salinization from over-irrigation poisoned the fields. Political instability fractured the region, and eventually the language itself fell silent, not because they were conquered by a superior force, but because the system that sustained them failed. The environment changed. The knowledge was not enough, and the civilization that had endured for 2 millennia faded into history, leaving behind only tablets buried in sand, waiting for someone to remember. We live now in a world more technologically advanced than anything the Sumerians could have imagined. We have mapped the human genome, split the atom, sent probes beyond the solar system, and yet we face the same existential threat. Rising seas, shifting climates. The slow realization that the systems we built are not as stable as we believed. The Sumerians had the flood, we have the climate crisis. Different scales, same pattern. And the question their tablets pose to us is this: will we listen? Will we record? Will we preserve? Or will we, like so many civilizations before us, believe ourselves immune to the forces that have always governed this planet? Because here is the final implication, the deepest lesson encoded in those ancient records. Human memory is short. Civilizational memory is even shorter. We forget. We dismiss. We call the past primitive and assume the future will always progress. But the Sumerians knew better. They knew that progress is not guaranteed. That knowledge must be actively preserved. That every generation must choose whether to remember or to forget. And forgetting is easier. It always has been. The flood stories survived not because they were pleasant, but because they were necessary. They were an inoculation against complacency, a reminder carved in stone and pressed in clay that the world is older than we think, stranger than we admit, and far less forgiving than we hope. The survivors told the story so that their children would not be caught unprepared, so that when the waters rose again, and they always rise, someone would remember what to do. How to build, how to plant, how to preserve the knowledge that matters, and that brings us here, to this moment, to you, listening now, across the gulf of 5,000 years, receiving a message written in wet clay by people who survived the end of their world and chose to speak anyway. They cannot tell us everything. The tablets are fragmented, the language is difficult, the meanings are layered, but what comes through, clear and undeniable, is this. We were here, we endured, we knew things you have forgotten, and we wrote it down so you could remember. The Sumerians never claimed to have all the answers. They recorded questions, mysteries, contradictions. They preserved the names of gods they could not explain, and described events they could not fully understand. but they trusted that someone someday would read those words and know what they meant. Perhaps that someone is us. Perhaps this is the moment when the message finally arrives, not as revelation, but as recognition. The slow, uncomfortable realization that the ancients were not primitive. They were survivors, and survival requires memory. So what do these ancient records mean for us today? They mean that history is not a straight line, that civilization is not inevitable, that the knowledge we possess is borrowed from those who came before and will be inherited by those who come after, if we choose to pass it on. They mean that the flood, in whatever form it takes, is always coming, and the only defense we have is this: to write, to remember, to preserve, to do what the Sumerians did when their world drowned, to press the knowledge into something solid, something lasting, something that will outlive the water. The tablets are still speaking. The question is whether we are finally ready to listen. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey through the flooded depths of memory, carried here on tablets of clay that refuse to dissolve, on words that would not die, on stories pressed into mud by hands that witness something we can barely comprehend. We began with a simple question. What if the Sumerian records are not mythology? What if they are history? We have traced the cuneiform signs from Gilgamesh's terror at mortality to Atrahasis' desperate construction, from Ziusudra's 7 days of storm to the moment the gods wept at what they had done. We have read descriptions of cities that vanished beneath waves, of kings who ruled for impossible spans, of a world so different from our own that it can only be called antediluvian, before the deluge, before the reset, before everything we call civilization began again from waterlogged ruins and traumatized survivors. The mainstream position remains clear. These are myths, allegories, exaggerations born from localized floods, cultural memories distorted across generations, the natural human tendency to dramatize the past and elevate ancestors to godhood. And yet, the details persist. The measurements are too specific, the geographical precision too exact, the consistency across multiple independent texts too deliberate. The Sumerians did not write like mythmakers. They wrote like archivists, like witnesses, like people desperately trying to preserve something true before it could be forgotten again. They recorded river levels, construction methods, divine dialogues, astronomical observations, all with the same sober precision, as though the flood that drowned the world was no more mythical than the harvest they recorded last season. What if they were simply telling us what happened? What if the antediluvian world was not primitive, but parallel? A civilization that rose, flourished, and drowned, leaving behind only fragments, refugees, and the terrible knowledge that it could all be lost? What if the Anunnaki, whether gods, survivors, or visitors, were as real to the Sumerians as the Tigris and Euphrates? What if the me, those divine codes of civilization, were not supernatural gifts but recovered technologies, salvaged formulas, knowledge pulled from the wreckage of a world that drowned? We may never know. The clay can only tell us so much. The cuneiform can only preserve what the scribes chose to press into wet earth. But the question echoes across 5,000 years, carried in every wedge-shaped mark, embedded in every king list, whispered through every hymn to Inanna and prayer to Enki. What came before? What was lost? And what are we still trying to remember? Perhaps that is the most profound legacy of the Sumerian tablets. Not answers, but the reminder that we do not know our own past as well as we pretend. That beneath the foundations of what we call the first civilization may lie the ruins of something older, drowned, nearly erased, but not entirely forgotten. The whispers remain, pressed into clay, buried in sand, waiting for those curious enough to listen. If you've made it this far, thank you, truly, for spending this time with me in the ruins of the first libraries, among the oldest words, tracing the outlines of a mystery that refuses to be solved, If this journey stirred something in you, a question, a doubt, a sense of wonder, leave a like. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what ancient mystery you'd like us to explore next. Subscribe if you want to continue diving into the forgotten corners of history, the places where the official story ends and the real questions begin. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It is still speaking, still waiting, still preserved in clay, in stone, in the shapes of ruined cities and the echoes of languages no one remembers how to speak. The flood did not take everything. Something survived, and we are still here, thousands of years later, trying to read the message left behind, sleep well, and dream of the world before the water rose,